Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and for today's side quest, I want to talk about Warcraft 3. You see, Warcraft 3, obviously the third game in the Warcraft series, that's kind of one of the big reasons that we know who Blizzard is today, is a game that I have spent so many hours on, but sometimes feel like collectively the world has forgotten about this game. So, why is that? Obviously, the reason is World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft is an enormously popular, massively multiplayer online RPG that changed the lexicon for people discussing it. Previously, the example that people would give for a game like that was EverQuest, and now it's WoW. And it continues to be WoW, even with usurpers that have tried, and in some cases succeeded to carve out pieces of it. WoW is still going strong. It has been 15 years, and it is doing fine. People know WoW. Movies have been made because of WoW. But the series started for me with Warcraft 2, but it started as a real-time strategy game. And Warcraft 3 hit for me at the best possible time because it came out the summer after the first Lord of the Rings movie came out, The Fellowship of the Rings, and I was primed for that particular pump. I was looking for fantasy games all over at the time. I even reinstalled Warcraft 2, and Warcraft 3 was probably the first game that I was like really closely following the beta for. I'd been following development cycles for video games for a long time, but this is the first one where I was like actively involved on forums discussing like character balance and so forth. And then when it came out, I stayed up till dawn for 3 days in a row, getting through the majority of the campaign, which was great. I thought it was a fantastic game, which I will talk about in a second. And then I just kept being involved, like with the forums and so forth. It was a game that I spent so much time on various forums as Quetzalcoatl 5, trying to get to know all the ins and outs, speculating on character balance. When the expansion pack, The Frozen Throne, came out, I had spent tons of time discussing with people how to properly balance characters, what things should be put in, and lore stuff. Like, I maintain that I started the rumor that the Night Elves were descended from trolls that were exposed to the Well of Eternity. And while I also maintain that that was hints that Blizzard put out, I was verified, and I find it fascinating to think about that, just in fan community stuff. Who knows? I'm sure I'm not the only one. I'm sure there were plenty of people, but I never saw anyone post about it before me, so yay. Anyway, so the game was a real-time strategy game like the ones before, and like StarCraft, which is still, frankly, the best real-time strategy game in terms of its time and place and release. And Warcraft 3 was criticized as not being as good as StarCraft because they tried to combine role-playing game elements. However, if you are not good at real-time strategy games like I am not, then having some of those RPG elements really helps the game work a lot better. It also really helps the campaign mode, a thing that they found out with StarCraft, which the StarCraft 2 kind of had to sort of adopt a little bit of. Having a role-playing game system allows you to have heroes in your single-player game, in your campaign, that grow and experience things and become stronger, and then implementing that in a real-time strategy setting, at the very least, is interesting. And it's not the first game to try this. I know there were plenty of games at the time, and I can't remember all their names at the moment, but there were plenty of games at the time that tried to incorporate role-playing game type elements into the real-time strategy setting. But Warcraft 3 did it really well. Each army had a number of heroes. It started off as 3 and expanded to 4 in the Frozen Throne expansion pack. But at any tier of play, you could only have one per level that you had attained. So the game was broken down into a 3-tier structure where you would build up your towns, and the highest advancement point of any of your like capital structure dictated what tier you were in. So for example, there was a town hall, and then a keep, and then a castle, and that was like the progression roughly for each one. And I shouldn't say roughly. One of the criticisms of the game was that each of the armies that you could choose between humans, orcs, night elves, and undead were structurally too similar to one another in their final implementation. But for at least the purposes of like tier settings, each one had that basic thing. And so you could have up to 3 heroes, with the first one you choose being the highest leveled one in play at any given time. And they all had different kinds of strengths and so forth, and bolstered your armies in certain ways. And oftentimes you would build your armies to work with that particular hero, such as like if you chose a very tanky kind of big bruiser type, you could go with a lot of ranged and ultimately a lot of mage characters because your big tanky character could stand up front and take all the hits. Stuff like that. It was tactical decisions, and ultimately it was just an extension of that real-time strategy element that in this particular case happened to grow stronger the more it fought. Now, like I was saying, the game was criticized for not being as unique in terms of each army as StarCraft was. StarCraft was considered a breakthrough from its predecessor, Warcraft II, where the two armies were functionally identical minus some magic stuff. In StarCraft, all of the armies had roughly analogous units, but the way they worked and the types of roles they played were vastly different. So like humans didn't have like melee options per se. They had guys with flamethrowers, which had its own implications, versus like Zerglings, which were high-speed, tiny little aggressor guys, versus Protoss Zealots, which were big, tough warrior types. Like the type of character was very different. In Warcraft, it was closer together. There was some deviation in that. Arguably, the two new armies, the Undead and the Night Elves, had more intricate kind of changes, such as the tier 3 melee for Night Elves were druids, and so they started off as magic characters and became bears. But regardless, effectively, everyone had like what was considered tier 1 melee, tier 1 ranged, tier 2 casters and artillery, tier 3 mages, flying units, and tier 3 melee characters. So like footmen for humans, and then knights at the top tier. Orcs had orc grunts at the first tier. At tier 3, they had the Tauren, etc., etc. They all kind of were roughly the same, although there was usually like a sort of idea of you either had a heavier front lineman, such as an orc grunt, and a weaker range, like their spear thrower, or like with the Night Elves, the archers and the huntresses, versus in the cases of the humans and undead, you had a less beefy front lineman, which was the footmen or the ghouls, and then like a beefier ranged unit like the dwarven riflemen or the undead. I'm blanking on the name of the spider mummy units that they used, but they fired spiders off because they were things of nightmares. Anyway, it was a fine game. Like, it was a lot of fun. The graphics were great. They held up really well for a really long time. Well enough that even a decade after it came out, in fact, I think more than that, I got really back into it. Now, the reason why is because while the campaign is very good and the lore is rich, the level editor is amazing, and I loved it so much. I realized that later games, newer things, have done more stuff with it. The things people have done with StarCraft 2, amazing. But Warcraft 3 was the parent of Dota, was the parent of League of Legends, was the parent of Heroes of the Storm, because you could build those kind of games out of it. The engine was great. Like, the models were simple enough you could make cool modifications to. The role-playing mechanics allowed for you to make more developed role-playing style games, and whole genres were born of this. I know technically Dota started before with StarCraft, but it really became alive with Warcraft 3, and there were tons of games built on that, and I fucking played around with that to death. I had worked out so much of a campaign that eventually was lost when my computer crashed, with campaigns for a high elf army, a horde remnant led by trolls and ogres, the Naga, and the Burning Legion. Because you could make a lot of stuff in this game. It already allowed for mercenaries, allowed for mercenary heroes at later levels. So they allowed for lots of non-specific to your race kind of elements to sort of break the balance. And as a result, this is why things kind of flattened out at a certain point. The original intricacies of the races were actually smoothed over by the Frozen Throne, because in order to balance the races, ultimately equivalent units needed to be created across the board. Because man, did people like to game the system. This is not new. This is also just in video games. I remember back in the day with StarCraft where it was like, well, if you're doing a comp stomp, quote unquote, you could just do all fucking wraiths because it will fool the AI. Like, man, people were all about like weird choices because that's what they enjoyed playing. Anyway, not to go too far down the rabbit hole of the type of fun you can have with the game once you've already played the game, and there is something to be said for a good level editor. Mario Maker is its standalone game, and this effectively provided an equivalent thing in the box. The Warcraft 3 campaign is great. The initial arc, the first two sections of the game are effectively one giant story about one character as he goes through different phases of his career, and it's fantastic. I don't think it's a big spoiler at this point. Arthas is pretty well known as being a big villain in the Warcraft franchise, but you start him off as a hero, and you really do a very effective Anakin Skywalker Darth Vader journey, which was also in the zeitgeist at the time because this came out in the middle of the prequels. The following parts of the campaign, the Orc campaign is actually a spin-off of an unreleased point-and-click adventure game that never actually came out, but was eventually adapted into a pretty good novel built around the Warcraft universe, focusing on this character called Thrall, who has since gone on to be big and important in the Warcraft lore, and I believe is dead in World of Warcraft now. Crazy stuff with video games, and that's the weird part about trying to step into this moment. It was a part of the narrative, and this is where it really started to expand. World of Warcraft began with the engine for Warcraft 3, and everything that has come since was built off of character models and sprites and all the resources of this game. So you get a pretty cool story with Thrall, and it's effectively like the grown-up story that we were promised we'd eventually get to. All those years of them teasing Warcraft adventures, here it was. Enjoy. And it was pretty good. And then it tied into what we'd been doing in the human and undead games. And then you get to the final chapter, which is the Night Elves, and they're sort of like the Protoss type. And it's a fun story of you making a stand to save the world, to save Azeroth, to save this reality. The sequel threw balance out the window, but you can also see them start to build the World of Warcraft engine into this game. There's the Orc campaign is basically just an RPG. Like, you just go and do a role-playing game, and it's cool that you can really do that. They really leaned into the flexibility of the game engine that they had built, and that's fantastic. The Blood Elf campaign is really good, which is a subset of the human campaign. The Night Elf campaign turns into the Naga campaign, which turns into the Blood Elf campaign, so all of that's actually pretty dope. And the Undead campaign is actually a really cool emotional sort of epilogue for Arthas. It's like the part that they were kind of missing for the character, which is actually has great emotional notes. In terms of writing, I mean, it's a big kind of goofy fantasy thing, but it's about as good as what your pretty good DMs would throw at you in a D&D game. So by all means, check it out. Like, it's a lot of fun to go through that adventure. And, it's kind of interesting to think that it's a very fantasy-esque kind of environment. And it's definitely built off of like Warhammer and off of D&D, but that's also built off of Chainmail, which is a strategy game. Ultimately, fantasy is so intertwined with the genre of strategy games that they're always going to come back to it. And there's going to be adventures that are more focused on heroes and ones that are more focused on parties. And this one's kind of a weird hybrid because you have heroes and they've got units, as opposed to Warcraft 2, where it's all about the army. There's very little emphasis on like individual heroes, or World of Warcraft, where it's all about the individual characters and you're each one playing a hero in a collective. And this is your squad game, and that's pretty cool. Like, your armies are limited way more than in previous editions, but as a result, you have to really focus on having tough units that can go for a couple battles, and that you actually have to like care about their individual actions. Like, micro becomes a really big term in the meta scene around this. Anyway, Warcraft 3 is often known as kind of that last step before World of Warcraft became the thing, and it became a huge thing that has sort of dominated pop culture for a long ass time. It's not as big as it used to be, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have the same cultural cachet that it used to have. But Warcraft 3 still stands out as a really good game that had real merit on its own, with a great single player experience and both multiplayer that was solid. And I haven't really talked about because I wasn't a huge multiplayer person because I got my ass whooped a lot, but it was a lot of fun, and it's one of the few times I really even dabbled in it. And also a game that you could kind of make your own stuff, and plenty of people have made full campaigns, like amazing campaigns that retell Warcraft 1, for example, or prologues to it, or their own games. And people, again, League of Legends and Dota started here, and Heroes of the Storm was a response. And because of the way their graphics engines work, it traces its way back to this game. Like, they're all kind of starting from this game. So it's really cool from a historical perspective, on top of it also just being a solid game that held up pretty well. Like, even now, they don't look that bad graphically. They all look blocky and stylized, but you know what? You're looking at everything from a distance, like, it looks fine. So yeah, I would encourage anyone to check out Warcraft 3, especially now that there's a remastered edition somewhere in development or released, I'm not sure. But yeah, it's good stuff. Obviously, it's a PC game, but if we're having a conversation about a real-time strategy game, are we really talking about using a controller? I love controllers, but we're just not going to have that conversation, okay? Anyway, again, I've been Case Aiken. You can find me a lot of places. On Twitter, @Case Aiken, but I also host a bunch of podcasts here on the Certain POV network. We've got Another Pass, which is a movie analysis podcast, Men of Steel, which is a Superman appreciation podcast, and Scruffy Nerf Herders, which is our company-wide Dungeons & Dragons Star Wars game. So check all that out at certainpov.com or on your podcatcher of choice, and happy gaming.